Hello and welcome to TNT. We're doing a series on grief, and one of the subjects we want to talk about today is complicated grief. You hear terms being thrown around about grief, and it doesn't do much good if you don't really understand them. And if you put them in context of what your understanding of anything complicated is, it may really sound like something that's rare and unusual. The reality is, it's not. It's not. Do you know anything about complicated grief, Megan? Have you heard much about it?
I don't know much.
Okay.
It does have something to do with the timeline, correct? So experiencing a great deal of grief pretty after the fact. So in the
Yes.
aftermath of the actual event.
Yes. So there is a simple, singular delineating feature which gets to be defined as complicated grief. And that is if you're grieving beyond a 6-month to 1-month period. By my definition, a majority of grief in that case is complicated.
Right.
So is complicated grief really that complicated, or has grief just been oversimplified in the world of psychology, where grief is supposed to be this, and everything that doesn't fit in this time period in this little box that spans 6 months, and if someone's being gracious, maybe it spans a year. Beyond that, it's complicated grief. The reality is, very few people fit into that simple 6-month to 1-year box.
Right.
Certain types of grief, you lose a job. You do grieve the loss of your job. However, when you do find another job, you've gone past all the grief emotions of losing your job, because it is, okay, there might be relational grief where you grieve the co-workers, people that you worked with who grew to mean something to you over a period of time. And there's, of course, the financial and the fallout from that. So you may grieve the loss of your home as a result of the loss of your job. But all of that falls in place once the basic issue is resolved, and all your secondary losses have been restored to you to some degree or another. Let's say it's grief over a family member. It could even be a parent. It could be a sibling. However, if you are distant from them emotionally or geographically, you're not going to grieve them over a prolonged period of time. Right. No matter that might be a blood relationship. If it is something, even your pet, and your pet has lived with you for 12 to 14 years, it's likely you're going to grieve that pet a lot longer than 6 months or 1 year. If that grief is debilitating, where you can't function without your pet, I would call that complicated. But being reminiscing about your memories with your dog or whatever pet you have, it'll bring a certain element of sadness to you. And over 6 months, 1 year, you will reminisce a whole lot more. And as the years go by, you will still remember that pet, but it will not necessarily be debilitating. So that makes it, I guess, uncomplicated.
That's interesting. When you think about the grief timeline too, grief changes a lot from the initial event and into the aftermath. So even when we lost Dad, of course, I had surgery 10 days later, and you were pretty occupied with that, but you're very much in survival mode and almost, intentionally repressing everything because you don't feel like you're capable of dealing with all of those emotions. And so you just push through. And for some people, it's years down the line before they even begin to address that grief and acknowledge it. So complicated grief.
You brought up an interesting point about repressing your grief. I know that's how I coped. It wasn't so much repressing my grief. My grief consumed me. There was no repressing it. I brought out the warrior in me. I said, okay, I'm going to fight this. I'm going to be as functional as I possibly can. I'm going to do everything that I need to do to keep going. A big part of that was caring for you, and
Right.
even, Kim, even though she didn't have the surgery and you did, both of you were in a very fragile situation
Right.
emotionally. The loss of your dad being sudden, unexpected, and premature. All of it that makes it very traumatic. However, for me to survive, I had to repress every memory of dad,
Right.
all the memories of our life together. I had to repress that because if I remembered, if I looked at pictures, to me, it's not just a picture. I can hear the voice. I remember what was going on around the time that picture was taken.
Right.
So it is a memory
You
that is
relive the
really
moment.
live. Yes, you relive it. And when you relive a moment, you relive the sights and the sounds and the smells, and all your senses come into play. And it was very, very difficult to do that and still go on and still keep moving forward. So I repressed memories. Not that I forgot, I just made a conscious decision every time they popped up. No, can't go there, or I'm not going to make it. And I know that's not true for many people. Many people take comfort and solace in looking at pictures and what have you. By that definition alone, by the fact that I needed to repress memories to survive, that is another hallmark point and characteristic of complicated grief. If you put this same thing in context of a different loss, and you're able to go back and look at pictures like, mom, 93 years old, what have you, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what a wonderful life she had. I remember this, I remember that. It's okay. That's not complicated grief because she lived a full life. Her death was not premature, and quite frankly, it wasn't traumatic. And geographically, she hasn't been living with us. So on a daily, day-to-day basis, on a 24-hour basis, we don't have constant reminders of her or
Right.
constant voids in our life.
Right.
Whereas with dad, we did. Because every moment of our life, for all of your life, and a good part of mine,
Right.
was we engaged with him. There was evidence of his presence in the house, even if he was not in the house in the moment. And also the hopelessness of knowing you can't reach him. I think that makes it that much harder. When someone's traveling, they're going to return, you can reach them by email or phone or WhatsApp or FaceTime or what have you. But when someone's gone, when they're passed away, that desperate need you have to communicate with them and just connect with them, and knowing you can't, that compounds your grief. So what other elements of complicated grief can we bring up?
Well, what are some of the other things you feel in complicated grief as opposed to, might just be, the grief you feel in the immediate aftermath of an event?
So let's see, you've done some research here on complicated grief. It talks about being overwhelmed about circumstances, just your everyday circumstances and the circumstances surrounding the death. Without question, you're worried about the consequences of a loss. Of course, you would be. Once again, if you've lost a spouse, you've also lost a friend, you've lost a financial provider.
Right.
And so all of those create complications that make it harder for you to grieve because you might risk losing your home. Many widows lose their jobs because they can't function as efficiently as they did. So those, however, when those issues get resolved, they may get resolved in 6 months or a year, or they may be issues that you live with for the rest of your life, and you've lost your home, you've lost your ability to work, you're too old to work, whatever it might be. And that grief continues long term. So that's what makes it complicated. What else in your research have you found, Megan?
Well, we already talked about the need to avoid or push away reminders of loss. And then the research also says a healthcare provider may refer to complicated grief as prolonged grief, chronic grief, or persistent complex bereavement disorder.
Yes, and it really becomes a disorder People think like, can you just get over your sadness? It's been 4 years or what have you, right? The problem is grief is not just an emotion of sadness. Grief changes even the chemical balance in your body and in your mind and your brain. It changes how you react and respond to situations, stressful situations, maybe romantic situations, watching a movie that has, a romantic theme to it.
Or a death scene.
A death
That's
scene.
still
A death scene is
5 years later, still I
Yeah.
can't get through
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, and it's not just the death, right? For me, it's watching the response of people who just found out
A loved one.
their loved one, they lost a loved one.
Mm-hmm.
Because that for me is a flashback instantly to our time,
Right.
So some of those things will be triggers. They keep coming up, and you just have to keep dealing with them for as long as they keep coming up. And I can't tell you that they'll be gone. I can't tell you that it'll be gone in a certain time frame, in a certain timeline. So if your grief is complicated, it's complicated. I don't know that, other than the most simplistic, distant, or non-traumatic losses, I don't know that grief can just be simple. More true to its nature would be that grief is complicated. So don't try to figure it out. Don't try to compare yourself with somebody else and say, why does she not feel this way I do? Just look at who you are, where you are, and figure out how to get through your grief. Do
Right.
whatever it takes to get through your grief. We had the same loss, but we grieved very differently.
Right.
And we grieved different relationship. You grieved the loss of a dad. I grieved the loss of a husband.
But even if you look at Kim, my sister, it's the same relationship.
Yes.
And our grieving journeys were vastly different.
Process is very different.
Right.
And that's because your personalities are different.
Absolutely.
Personalities are different. So that's the last bit of advice I'll leave you on this one is don't compare your grief with somebody else. Just process your grief. Don't sit with the label, oh, she has complicated grief. It just means you have grief that's more true to its nature, and just deal with it and get counseling, get therapy, surround yourself with people who understand, who listen, and do whatever it takes for you. So thank you for joining us on this segment on complicated grief. There's more to come. So stay tuned, and we will see you at our next video on TNT.